Fala pessoal, estamos aqui com ele, a lenda, J.M. DeMatteis. Adjetivos faltam para falar desse senhor que está ao meu lado. Um dos caras mais incríveis, um dos melhores roteiristas que a gente já teve o prazer de publicar aqui no Pipoca Nanquim. Como vocês sabem, nós trouxemos ele aqui para a CCXP. Ele teve várias sessões de autógrafo, ele teve painéis aqui e ele encontrou um tempinho para conversar com o Pipoca Nanquim um pouquinho sobre a carreira dele, né? Então eu vou fazer algumas perguntas para ele. Hello, JM. How are you?
I'm exhausted, but otherwise fine. Yeah.
Yes, exhausted because today is Sunday.
Right.
It's
and
the last day,
yeah,
right?
And it's been nonstop since Wednesday. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
It's a pleasure.
So, first of all, I know that already because we talked a lot, but I would like you to explain to the audience, how did you start on this business?
Well, you know, I've always been creative since the time I was a kid. I spent most of my childhood on the floor drawing. Drawing was my first love, which I realized years later really helps when you're writing comic books if you have a visual sense. So drawing was my first love. I was actually supposed to go to art school after high school, but I come from a working class family. My parents said we can't afford that, and that was the end of that.
Okay.
You know,
you grew up in New York, right?
I grew up in Brooklyn, yeah.
Brooklyn.
Yeah. So first there was art, but then along the way came music and rock and roll. So I learned to play the guitar. I played in bands for years, songwriter, singer, the whole thing. But I always knew how to write. It was just a natural thing that I had, you know? And at a certain point I knew that I wanted to be a writer, not just a comic book writer, but a writer to write everything, you know? And I was a journalist for a while, a music journalist. So I took my love of music and my love of writing and I put that together, and I was a music journalist. Reviewed albums, reviewed concerts, interviewed musicians, and but I knew I wanted to write comics too because I loved comics from the time even before I could read.
Right.
And basically, I just kept trying. You know, you'd send something in, they'd reject you. You'd send something in, and finally,
did you go straight to the majors, Marvel and DC?
When I was 18, I had no idea what a comic book script looked like, and I wrote one. I sent it to Marvel, got a nasty letter back. Basically telling me how terrible it was, you know. But when you have a passion, that doesn't matter. You just keep going, you know.
Yeah.
So eventually, I sent some samples to DC, and they said that Paul Levitz, you know Paul Levitz, right?
Yes, of course.
And he was, at the time, he was maybe 23 years old, and he'd been working there since he was 16.
Whoa.
Yeah. So he was editing House of Mystery, Weird Word Tales, all those anthology comics, if you remember those.
Yes,
that's
I do.
That's where new writers used to break in. You write 5-page stories, 8-page stories, a great way to learn. So same thing. I sent these stories into Paul. I got a letter back, tearing my stories to pieces. But at the bottom it said, please feel free to submit again. That's all I saw.
All right.
You know, so that's the thing. Rejection is part of the game, and you can't let it stop you. Any little bit of encouragement, you have to go where that is. Took me about 5 months, 6 months, but I finally sold him something. And I still remember to this day, Paul shook my hand and said, welcome to the business. It's one of my favorite moments of my whole career.
So
and
nice.
That started the ball rolling.
I have some old, there was a company here in Brazil called Ebal. It doesn't exist anymore, but during many years they published material from DC Comics. And they published some of these stories you wrote, including I, Vampire.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you wrote
First
that.
thing I ever created for comics, I, Vampire and Creature Commandos.
Yeah, really?
Now Creature Commandos is on HBO Max. It's a big series. Who knew? It was like, I was brand new to the business, you know?
This is so nice.
Yeah.
So we published 2 books by you, Blood and Moonshadow. First, I would like to talk about Blood because the first time I read it, I was a teenager, and it impressed me a lot. And it's a very unusual take on the vampire.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that?
Right, the story is like a fever dream, you know? And
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's related to Moonshadow because I worked on Moonshadow with John J. Muth. John J. Muth and Kent Williams were good friends. They went to art school together, the whole thing. And
At that time, sorry to cut you, but at that time, genius like those guys, they worked for comics.
Yeah.
It was incredible.
Yeah.
Now they were only in art galleries.
Right. Well, John J. Muth is a very successful writer and illustrator of children's books. That's what he's been doing for the past 20, 25 years.
Nice.
And very successfully. Anyway,
Back to Moon Shadow,
so
to Blood.
Kent did an issue of Moon Shadow. Kent and I actually ended up living next door to each other in the same apartment complex. So we knew we wanted to work on something together. And one of the things that always fascinated me about writing is the point when the unconscious mind completely takes over. You know, we think we're writing the story, but really it all comes from back here, from the unconscious mind.
So you stop being rational?
In a way, because at a certain point with every story, I get out of the way and the story, it's like it's coming through from another dimension. And I really mean that. It's like it's coming from someplace else.
Like a flow.
Yeah. So I thought, I want to do a story, how do I put this, where I'm consciously writing from my unconscious. You know, just whatever's in there, let's see what comes out. And Kent had this amazing sketchbook where he had designed all these characters. He had no idea what they were for, but he had all these designs. So he said, let's take these designs that you did, and I, from my unconscious, will create a story to go with that.
Oh, so
And
interesting way of
he literally
working.
lived next door. We would run back and forth to each other's houses with ideas. Let's do this, let's do that. And back, here's the artwork, here's the script, back and forth, back and forth. It was an amazing way to work together. And that's how Blood came together. It's almost like, you know what a Rorschach test is? The ink blot?
Yes, of course.
You can look at that story and come away with 1,000 different interpretations. I know what it means for me, but it might mean something completely different for you.
Yeah.
You know?
I know, because of course there's the story you created,
Yes.
the way he visualized it, and there's the story the reader
Yes.
creates in his mind. When
Exactly,
It's
exactly.
incredible. How did you pitch that at the time?
Epic Comics was great. That's where we did Moon Shadow. They were open to the 80s in comics in general. It was incredible
The
because
best time.
just knocking down all the walls, you know? And, you know, we were very successful with Moon Shadow. They knew Kent's work, they knew my work, and they said, let's do it. And we did it.
Oh, incredible.
And then later we took both those books from Epic to Vertigo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I remember that too. And there's a lot of sensuality in both books too, which with beautiful ladies and erotic things.
More in Blood, yeah, than Moon Shadow.
Yeah.
A little bit in Moon
A
Shadow.
little bit in
yeah.
the shadow too. And there is a lot of violence too, but it's not explicit. Right.
Because it's not what it's not what the story is about. The story of Blood is really about a spiritual search. It's about this person who has been transformed into this thing he doesn't want to be, and he's seeking redemption. And it's also about the cyclical nature of life. I don't want to give away the story in case someone out there hasn't read it, but the end is the beginning, basically,
Yes,
of that story.
So it's the cycle, right?
Yeah, it's reincarnation, it's the cyclical nature of the universe, it's all these things together.
And what about Moon Shadow? Did you have the idea that it would be so epic when you start writing it?
I had that idea when I was a teenager.
Oh, really?
And it was a very different feeling to it. It was called Stardust at the time in my head. You know, I wasn't working in comics or anything. It was just an idea that I had. I had the idea of the intergalactic zoo and the kid growing up, but it was more in when I originally envisioned it. It felt more like a Jim Starlin cosmic adventure kind of thing.
Okay.
You know, very different than what it ended up being.
So it was something like Dreadstar or something.
Yeah, or his Warlock comics or something. It had a feeling like that in my head, but it was just in my head, you know? And time went by, I kept developing it, and again, it was the 80s and things were expanding, and I'm working on all these Marvel superhero comics, but I'm seeing all the new stuff that's happening at Epic and at DC, and I said, I need to do something that's mine.
Mm-hmm.
I need to step outside of those universes and just write as if I'm writing a novel, not as you get in a mindset, I'm writing a comic book, it has to be this way, but it really doesn't.
Yeah.
So I pitched it first to Jim Shooter and then to Archie Goodwin at Epic, and they said, let's go and do it. And through the grace of God, I found John J. Muth.
Was the shooter open to that?
Yes, he was the first one I pitched it to, and he read it and he said, bring it to Archie at Epic. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And so I was friends with the artist Dan Green.
Mm-hmm.
Dan Green was friends with John J. Muth. We met, John and I, and it was this
instant chemistry.
magic, instantly. And I challenged him, he challenged me, and we created something together that we couldn't have created individually. And that's the beauty of comics, right?
And the story started to grow from there.
Exactly. It talk about writing from the unconscious. that story was as if the old man who was the narrator was really telling the story to me, and I was writing down what he was telling me.
Do you think somehow you were, because you were a musician, do you think somehow you were influenced by those space operas from the 70s, works like that were breaking all kinds of conventions?
Oh, that's interesting. I never thought about that. I don't know about that, but as a musician, I see the music in writing. I see the music in comics. You know, you look at comics, they're all written in these little captions across the page. It's like lyrics. It's like a rhythm. There's a melody that goes, something weaves through the pictures. Then the sound effects are like a drum underneath that. You know, there's all these musical elements, the way you have to have, almost the way a chorus draws you into the verse, you have to get to the next page. So perfect. I see writing in a very musical way.
Nice.
Always have, yeah.
Well, in my opinion, you also wrote the best Spider-Man story ever, which is Kraven's Last Hunt. It's the impact for me was unbelievable. But in a way, it's a very unusual Spider-Man story too, because it's dark and it's not dark in fact, but it's darker than it used to be for the character.
Well, certainly darker than it was back then for Spider-Man comics. Yeah.
My question is, how did you convince Marvel to accept that story?
You know, the truth of the matter is, there was no problem.
Again,
I was invited. Originally, Mike Zeck and I were going to be doing Spectacular Spider-Man together. And this was another idea that I had for years. I've been developing it. I pitched it as a Batman story, all these different versions that were in my head. And they said, you know, come and write Spider-Man for us. And I pitched them the story. And they just went, sure. That was it. I didn't have to
was an
convince
amazing
anybody.
time.
It was an amazing time. And originally, Kraven was not the villain.
Oh, really?
I created an original villain for that story. But one day I was flipping through remember the handbook of the Marvel Universe?
Yeah.
And I got to Kraven the Hunter, and it said that he was Russian, which I never knew. And I love Dostoevsky.
Okay.
I love Russian literature, and I kind of went,
me too.
I know who this guy is. Changed the whole story for me. And he came in and he took over the story, you know?
Oh, unbelievable.
And again, that's what I mean about the unconscious. I didn't plan that.
It just happened.
It just happened. And so many things worked in favor of that story. The fact that Peter and Mary Jane were just married, that added much more emotion to the story. You know, he had to get back to his wife. The fact that he was in the black suit, it wouldn't have worked as well if he was in the regular, you know, bright suit.
That's
all
true.
These elements came together. And I always say the story has a life of its own. And I may have my timing, like I wanted it to be a Batman story. It wasn't supposed to be. It had to wait for that moment when all those elements came together and Mike Zeck was there. And because of Mike Zeck, we'd worked on Captain America, we created Vermin together. So brought Vermin into the story. All these elements came together. And also the fact that I just finished Moonshadow expanded my idea of how you can write a comic book.
All right.
It wouldn't have written it the same way if I hadn't done Moonshadow.
Unbelievable. You have some great comic books that were never released in Brazil. Talk to us a little bit about Broken Dreams.
Brooklyn Dreams originally did at DC. They had an imprint called Piranha Press. Andy Helfer was the editor of that, who was also our editor on Justice League International. And it's basically an autobiographical comic about growing up crazy and dysfunctional in Brooklyn in the 1970s.
Whoa,
yeah,
that's heavy.
But in a very nonlinear way. So something happens, the narrator is basically me. So I start to tell you a story, but I remember, oh wait, but this happened when I was 10, and then we go back to this story, and this happened when I was 14.
Okay.
And you go back. So it jumps through time, and it's the same theme as Moonshadow, except it's my story of when I was a kid on a spiritual search looking for meaning in my life while living in Brooklyn with a crazy family.
All right. You are also a novelist too.
Yes.
That's very interesting because you told me that you don't like to keep on doing the same thing. So you go for comics, then you work with animation,
yes.
And you write a novel. Tell us a little bit about this side of yours.
Well, you know, even when I've worked in comics, if you read Moonshadow, there's a lot of prose in there.
Yeah,
you know, it's
course.
very prose heavy. Because a lot of people talk about comics like it's movies on paper, but I think comics can be anything. And I like the connection between comics and prose, and comics and poetry.
And in Moonshadow, you make an homage to your, probably what I think are your favorite
literary
authors.
heroes. Yeah, exactly,
Yes.
exactly. So I've always liked prose and kind of revered prose. About 15 years ago, I did a a fantasy novel for young readers called Imaginalis that was published in the United States. I don't think it ever came out here. And the past few years, I've been working with this company called Neotext, and I've done 2 novellas that I think are some of the best things I've ever done.
Whoa.
One is called The Witness, and it's got 10 illustrations by J.H. Williams III.
He's great.
Who's phenomenal and was a pleasure to work with. And the other is called The Excavator, and it has 10 illustrations and a cover by a brilliant Greek artist that a lot of people don't know, named Vasilis Godzilas. And I just finished a new novel called Dark Future that will be out in January in the United States.
That's so nice. Congratulations.
Yeah.
It would be awesome to publish this material here.
I would love to see it.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah.
So I won't take your time anymore, but I'm saying thank you very much for talking to us, to the Brazilian audience. It was an enormous pleasure to have you here, you and your lovely wife, Diane, who is sitting right there. JM, it was an honor to meet you personally.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been great to meet you. Really, really great.
Thank you so much. Pessoal, muito obrigado, audiência, valeu. Como vocês sabem, temos vídeos toda quarta, sexta e domingo. Deixe o seu like aí, porque se você der bastante like e curtir esse vídeo, a gente vai considerar trazer um monte de material inédito dessa figura emblemática que é o JM Demetrius. Valeu, gente!